so much. It's an honor.
I think I would like to ask if I could break with protocol. We have Mark Davis here. I need to get him up if that's okay. Mr. Davis, if you would come on up, please. And Mr. Davis, if you would tell us your name, where you live, what you do, and I know you've been here a while, but tell us your concerns.
All right. Thank you for having me, everyone. Pleasure to speak with you today. My name is Mark Davis, and I'm the president of Data Productions. The committee has a copy of my sworn affidavit. For the sake of time, I've kind of boiled it down to maybe a 3 or 4 minute presentation, and hopefully I won't get too far in the weeds with you here. I'm certainly going to try to keep your attention. I've been working with voter data for more than 30 years. I've testified as an expert witness in a total of 5 election disputes. When I processed an update to my copy of the Georgia database I received in August, I saw hundreds of thousands of voters whose name and address records matched against USPS national change of address records. I've been seeing similar numbers for many years now. My understanding of the core issue is that every state in the union is permitted to address those issues in accordance with the provisions of the 1993 National Voter Registration Act. The Act permits a Secretary of State to mail a voter with an NCOA match at both their old and new addresses to obtain confirmation of the change of address, but as a practical matter, when that happens, those requests are often ignored. The only other remedy available to a Secretary of State under that law is to allow the voter's registration to age out of the system for inactivity, which can often take years. The net effect of all that is our Georgia database always contains hundreds of thousands of people who have filed changes of address with the USPS stating they have moved away from the address shown on their voter registration records, and that opens up a Pandora's box of potential issues. I have recently completed NCOA processing on another copy of the voter database I obtained just last week. It showed approximately 267,255 voters who have told the USPS they were moving to an address out of state. Some of those will no doubt be students and people serving in the military who intend to return to Georgia, and of course, lawfully they are permitted to vote. I show just under 15,000 of those out-of-state movers voted in our November general election. The NCOA processing also revealed approximately 313,000 or so voters who moved within the state of Georgia. Those who move within a county can still vote in that county and update their registration as required. However, of those who moved within the state, I'm showing 122,000 or so who moved across county lines. Most of them obeyed the law and did not cast ballots. That said, I do show over 40,000 voters who moved across county lines more than 30 days before the election, but then cast a ballot in their previous county of residence. If those were all temporary relocations, they were eligible, but I think it highly likely the vast majority are not temporary. Georgia law states if a voter moves more than 30 days before the election and has failed to update the registration, he or she may not lawfully cast a ballot in the county they previously resided in, which makes a great deal of sense. Outside of that 30-day grace period or a temporary change of address, a person who does not permanently reside in a county they cast a vote in has no legal or moral right to cast votes for public servants who no longer represent them. A person who moves across county lines more than 30 days before the election and fails to update their registration is no longer allowed to cast a vote in their old county and at the same time is not properly registered to vote in their new county. It appears to me we probably had tens of thousands of unlawful votes cast in our last election. I can only imagine how many close election contests have been affected by these issues over the years.
Any questions for Mr. Davis? Senator Dolezal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Memo number 5.
Thank you, Mr. Davis, for being here. I've actually been looking forward to your testimony since we had the opportunity to speak outside earlier. I think that this may be where there's the most there when we're looking at what happened in our past election. I think this is probably where there's the most there of what we need to fix going forward. I'd like for you, if you can, to highlight for me some locations where in your data you've seen hundreds or even thousands of people registered to vote from the same address.
Well, I ran that query just last night, and there's one homeless shelter that I believe that counts over 2,000. Several on the list are homeless shelters, and you see hundreds or even thousands of voters there. Now, I'm told that that's encouraged. I try to think through that in my head, and I see lots of potential for fraud there. It's a concern for me. If just anybody can go register at a homeless shelter and vote, I don't know. I think that's something we need to be looking at. To be honest, I've been more focused on these change of address and residency issues lately.
So let's talk about those for a second. So what happens is somebody informs the United States Postal Service, and I just recently did this, hey, I'm moving. We then, depending on, like you mentioned, depending whether it's in county, out of state, depends on what should happen with them in the voter rolls. Mm-hmm. How many people are you aware of, and I asked the Secretary of Staff this question this morning, they did not know. How many people are you aware of in the state of Georgia who filed a COA request with the U.S. Postal Service and also requested an absentee ballot and had their absentee ballot mailed to them outside of the state of Georgia?
I believe that number's right at about 15,000. But again, if they're students of the military or they have a legitimate reason to be located out of state and they intend to come back, then those votes are lawful.
Are you aware of any specific cases maybe that you could highlight for us, not using real names, but using some fake names of people that perhaps we would assume are not students, people that maybe you've looked at their LinkedIn file or you have other information on them being employed out of state, yet they're still voting as Georgia residents? With this data, I wanted some other eyes on it. So I've made a friend who's a former FBI special agent, and he's kind of a nerd about data like I am, and I've kind of brought him into it, and I gave him a copy of the data, and he has spent days pouring through it and tells all kinds of interesting stories about people who moved to Portland 4 years ago, moved from 3 different apartments during that period, voted in Georgia. A guy took a job in New York, lives up there now, voted in Georgia. The 1993 NVRA forces every Secretary of State in this union to keep millions and millions of bogus registrations on their rolls. And in some of the cases where I've testified as an expert witness, it's not enough to go in there and say, here's proof this person moved. The only time I've seen judges actually take action is when you put that voter on the stand under oath and say, did you move from this address to this address with the intention of changing your permanent residency? And when we've done that, then the judges have ruled with us. But absent that, under the NVRA, our Secretary of State is virtually powerless to remove them. What's interesting to me is a whole lot of these that I picked up, they've already been put on inactive status. And if you look in the field for status reason, it says NCOA. In other words, our Secretary of State has already picked these up at some point, a lot of them, large numbers of them. But he's powerless to do anything about it until they age off the rolls. Now, there's a difference between the requirements of the 1993 NVRA and our own state laws. If you read 21.2, 217, and 218, our residency requirements for actually casting a vote are pretty crystal clear, okay? But there's a disconnect between making it unlawful to cast a vote in unlawful circumstances or when your residency is not correct. There's a difference between that and actually cleaning up the rolls here, because there's just a lot of room for a lot of issues there with all this all these bogus voters on our rolls still. I mean, some of these folks that are registered here are no doubt registered in other states. We don't know because we don't have a national registry. In my view, our federal government should create one. If you're a New York snowbird and you spend your winters in Florida, you should be able to still vote in New York. But the minute you decide Florida's your home and you register to vote there, that information should go to a national voter clearinghouse and then straight to New York. And as soon as you've registered in Florida, you should come off the rolls in New York. The other thing we can do about it is get the Postal Service to change the way they do NCOA. They should ask, is this change of address temporary or permanent? And if they did just that, so we gather that data, and then we change the law and allow our secretaries of state to actually act on it, we could go a long way towards cleaning up this problem.
You mentioned earlier that approximately 40,000 people filed a change of address form from one county to a new county in the state of Georgia, yet voted in their old county. Is that correct?
Yes, and see, there's
Can I ask you
actually
a follow-up question real quick on that, if you don't mind? What was the breakdown of how did they vote? How many of them were ABM? How many of them were early in person? How many of them were voted on election day?
I'd have to dig it out of my affidavit, but off the top of my head, I'm wanting to say it was maybe 18,000 absentee and 12 in person day of.
Okay, thank you.
But I want to make a point there. Okay, there was actually 122,000 folks that are similarly situated. Most of them followed the law and didn't cast a ballot. Okay, so there's kind of a 14th Amendment issue there of equal protection. Why do some people get to break the law and vote, and some people who know better and don't, they don't have their vote counted? So that's troubling too. I think one thing that we could do that would be very helpful is if we identified these folks going into an election and sent them a notice of some kind saying, hey, this is what we see. We want you voting in the right place for the right people, and we want your vote to count. Please take steps to get this corrected if this applies to you. If your change of residence was permanent, not temporary, then take the steps needed to protect your right to vote. Otherwise, they don't have any business voting for a sheriff of a county they don't live in anymore.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Senator Summers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Number 3. Mr. Davis, in regards to our upcoming runoff election, January the 5th, are you saying that if people are doing what we think they're doing, they're just coming into our state to register to vote in that election, that our Secretary of State or basically this legislature is powerless to do anything about them, and that so-called fine of $100,000 and 10 years in prison means absolutely nothing?
Well, that's kind of a different subject. I know they're going to be having investigators look at the rolls and whatnot. But what I can tell you is this. There's over 500,000 folks on the Georgia voter database that have told the U.S. Postal Service they were moving elsewhere, okay? Over 250,000 of those out of the state. So if there's a group out there trying to get those folks to vote here in Georgia by chasing them down their new address, that information is readily available simply by running NCOA on the voter database. And they could be contacted and encouraged to vote here. And arguably, if they make the argument that they only moved away temporarily, they could legally get away with it, even if the truth of the matter is that they actually did move away permanently.
A follow-up, please. What about people moving into the state in this little short window that we have that can say they live in a dorm room or they live in a hotel room or whatever? What about that issue?
It's hard to detect. But we can see who registered recently, and we can give them increased scrutiny, and I would suggest we should.
Senator Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Davis, and you might have said this earlier, but how many ballots were requested and sent out outside of the state, whether it be military or
I haven't run the count of how many were sent, but the count of how many voted was about 15,000.
About
Now, if they're all students or military or temporary address changes, fine.
Right.
But if that's not the case, there's probably some illegal votes in there. I know that of the folks that moved across county lines within the state, we probably have a great deal of those that were just flat out wrong.
right.
I mean, I just have a hard time believing that, 40,000 folks would just temporarily move within the state intending to go back where they used to live.
Right.
So-
Senator Brass?
7. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Davis, of that 40,000, is there a way to drill down and determine which counties?
Absolutely.
Were there any counties that stood out, that had way more than any other county?
If you'll give me your card, I'll send you that query. I've done it. I don't have it with me.
Okay.
I can tell you that when I did drill down and I geocoded and mapped the people at their new address, and I looked at that map, these issues seem to be happening in literally every county in the state, just all over the place.
Fair enough. Thank you.
So no question. Okay. Senator Tillery?
I'm Blake Tillery. I thought I saw today where we were actually sued, or the Secretary of State's office was actually sued, possibly today, or maybe it was yesterday, for trying to clean up some of the questions that you just proposed. Did you see that?
I'm unaware of it, but I don't doubt it. This is the thing, I try to be fair to the Secretary of State, and he's handicapped by the 1993 NVRA. And if you look in my my sworn statement that I filed, I've got a link in there to the DOJ website that's got a FAQ, frequently asked questions, and one of them explains what a Secretary of State has to go through just to remove a voter from our rolls who moved away 4 years ago. There was one case that I testified in up in House 28 where we found a guy who sold his house here, moved to North Carolina, and has been coming back here to vote for years, okay? And so I said to the attorney, well, why don't we get him in court? We can't have this. And he's like, well, subpoenaing somebody from out of state is tough and expensive, and we've got lower hanging fruit, so we'll just let it go. But that stuff happens. And, I mean, you can point fingers at the Secretary of State, but from what I see, when a Republican Secretary of State does his job and lets voters age out who moved years ago, and then he finally does a purge, he's accused of Republican vote suppression. Well, when a Democrat Secretary of State does the same thing, he's praised for his quality list management. So that's my take on it for what it's worth. But they're all subject to the exact same law, they all have the exact same issues, and they all have the exact same limitations.
Okay, well, thank you, Mr. Davis. We're going to move on now. Appreciate you being here.
Thank you.